one of my favorite quotes from Jeff Rothenberg, digital information lasts forever or 5 years, whichever comes first. There is a tremendous issue with electronic records generally. It's not just electronic archiving. It's the fact that there is a need to deal with the legacy aspects of electronic data in the universe we are in. And that means that we have to come up with better migration strategies across platforms that work. And so when we're thinking about email in particular, it's an ephemeral medium. It needs to be migrated in ways that we will get into in this webinar because of retention requirements. And my bottom line is that the folks at ZyLAB and others who are thought leaders in the space, who are solution providers thinking about email archiving, are getting it exactly right in terms of how to preserve email for the long term. Other strategies just haven't worked, and we're going to talk about that. So the next slide is on the Supreme Court on record retention. And what this is a baseline for anyone in the United States, particularly any lawyer. If you know a lawyer, if you are a lawyer, you should cite to this as a at least the foundational document in the field that recognizes in dicta in this case, but still important dicta, that there are such things as document retention policies, and that it is not wrongful for a manager to instruct his employees to comply with a valid document retention policy under ordinary circumstances. That retention policy necessarily means long-term retention in some cases, sometimes short-term retention, but it definitely talks about, it implies to us in the field a life cycle of records that includes disposition. Disposition is absolutely key, and so whatever your solution to your own email and electronic records issues, we need to have disposition front and center in our minds, whether we're in the cloud or in a silo or otherwise, whether we're talking about email archiving or otherwise. We need to talk about a life cycle that includes disposition, and to make that something that is easy for all of us to deal with. Otherwise, we just have accumulating petabytes of stuff. So next slide. The lifespan. So I came from 33 years in government before joining Drinker Biddle a couple months ago, and this slide is one that I had used before, and I think it's just, but it's applicable across the board. In the public sector, whether you're in federal, state, local, whatever, you have some subset of records that are long-term. In the federal sector, we have a statutory site that gives what a record is, and some of them are permanent, and that you can actually go to the National Archives one day and see email, although we can talk about that later on. And some are very short-term, ephemeral, day-only records. And so the concept of a record being kept in an archive does not mean permanent. It means it could mean permanent, it could mean temporary, it could mean ephemeral. The problem is matching up the retention span with the life of information technology. If you have a 50-year record under a record schedule, no one that is on this webinar call has ever dealt with an electronic record that is 50 years old. And we wouldn't really know how to deal with the legacy objects if presented on our desktop with them, with old floppy disks and whatever. And so, and the USB flash drives of today won't be around 50 years from now. So we are all living in a continual state of change in terms of legacy electronic objects. Then coupled with that, huge volumes of data that make life interesting in larger institutions. And so we need to factor that in. Anyway, the lifespan of records in the public sector, bottom line, can be very, very long. In fact, one more thing, which is that I dealt with in the National Archives temporary records that were up to 10,000 years in record retention span. And that came as a surprise to many, but the Department of Energy actually has some having to do with the time with radioactive decay. Now, having said that, flipping now to the private sector, and that's fine, Mary. We have a host of statutes that apply to the long-term retention of email and other records, 7 years and up. And so there are different lengths depending on which statute we're talking about. But we increasingly see in verticals in the private sector the need for corporate institutions to be paying attention to email and other forms of electronic communications, such as messaging and whatever, but email primarily to meet statutory and regulatory requirements and compliance. And so we can't just think about public sector, we think about private sector, we think about the need for archiving beyond the janitor function on a live network. And that's what we're talking about here. Now, next slide. These slides will be available, and so anyone who wants to, jot down all those citations, well, Mary and Jan can give the slides. Now, here we have e-record keeping preservation strategies. Okay, so there's been this long transition to email archiving, and through these different methods, we have arrived at this happy date where we could offer solutions in the space. When I was litigating the props case in the 1990s, the standard way that some organizations kept electronic records was backup tapes. And even though NARA's regulations in the federal sector said that that wasn't the optimal method, and in fact were written to preclude it. Print to hard copy, most of the government still prints email to hard copy, but things are changing, and we're going to talk about that. If I had a show of hands on this webinar of who saves email electronically, I bet you would all raise your hand, but you might be doing that to online foldering, whether it's Microsoft Outlook or any system that you may be using. The fact is that online foldering and the fact that you're doing your record keeping idiosyncratically is not of real or optimal benefit to the organization as a whole. It's very good for users. It's not very good for trying to deal with e-discovery demands. You need some sort of central repository to meet sort of the enterprise requirements. Now, along the way in government, about 15 years ago, there was this 515.2 standard, but the issue for that, if people know 515.2, is that it's a very good set of functional requirements. To the extent it's been deployed, there have been issues with respect to the fact that it relies on people to drag and drop objects. And the question then is are we all compliant? And you can answer that for yourselves, but I know from my own experience of 33 years lawyering, which is that I'm too busy to drag and drop objects and to print and file emails as such, and so looking for a better way. And that's what this sort of seminar is all about, and why email archiving is so important. Next slide, Mary. Yeah, this is a slide of the organization's knowledge collectively, but if we file in folders ourselves rather than using an email archiving approach, we are basically dealing with each user having his own account, and that doesn't make sense. The organization can't reach in and touch all personal drives and non-shared drives, and so we need data and information in central places. Next slide. And yes, the long transition to email archiving. Well, it's like Groundhog Day. I've been around so long that it feels like I wake up every morning and it's like the same Sonny and Cher song. So we need to find a path forward. All right, next slide. And email is the 800-pound gorilla here. So keeping on my movie theme, which is that we're basically dealing with email as the candid medium of our age. Now we will get beyond it. My daughter says email is for old people, Daddy. We all understand that there's a transformation going on in terms of social media and the use of collaborative spaces that may be replacing email. But email is still the gotcha document of the age, and billions are being produced in corporate America and across the public sector, and we need to deal with it. Next slide. So email archiving defined. Well, you can go to Wikipedia and have a detailed definition. It's a an automated process for all inbound and outbound email messages. That's really the key word in this paragraph is all. The litigation risk goes down in terms of e-discovery. If you're going to implement email archiving, the reason to sell it to the C-suite as a matter of information governance is because you are capturing information and lowering your litigation risk by mitigating the chance that there's lost emails in the organization or ones that can't be found. So that's really what I would concentrate on. The benefits are as outlined here, and I must say I put in a plug, Mary, for your excellent paper that ZyLAB's produced on email archiving, which hopefully we will be able to make available to everybody in terms of where to go on a link.
Oh, thanks, Jason.
So, and the Sedona Glossary has email archiving or electronic archiving as well. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is your paper, and you know, when a company in any form of legal dispute emails the first data requested, the archive chosen needs to be e-discovery ready. I think that is a key. Any kind of email archiving that one does, it doesn't make sense just to put stuff in if you can't get it out. The access is very important, and one needs to ask lots of questions about how that's going to be accomplished when you're setting that up. You need an email archive for litigation hold purposes and for searches, and you need it to be able to do things like deduplicating. So, next slide. Beyond email, there's text messaging. As I said, there's social media. We recognize that in this call, but we're concentrating on email. Next slide. The moving to the cloud. Well, this is a key pivot for organizations today. In government, everyone is under a mandate from the Obama administration, all agencies, to move email to the cloud. To justify why they're not. In the private sector, obviously for reasons of cost, efficiency, the elasticity of supply and demand, it makes a lot of sense to move to the cloud. However, I challenge the people on this webinar. If your IT people are moving data to the cloud, including email, have they incorporated records people and lawyers into the conversation about embedding records management processes and electronic archiving in particular while that migration is taking place? There's a lot of benefits to go to the cloud, but if you're just putting emails or other electronic records in the cloud without any consideration of how long they will be retained or how they will be accessed, then there are issues that you are putting off to another day, but very big ones. And so we at the National Archives, while I was there, we went to the cloud on a platform from our legacy system, but we did it at the same time of implementing a new policy, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Go ahead. Next slide. So there's this, the Presidential Memorandum that I'm very proud to have been part of a movement with is the first time since Harry Truman that records in the government were brought to the fore to the President saying that we have to do something smarter in the space. So 1950 through 2011, next slide. And the memorandum from President Obama said that decades of technological advances have to be taken into account. We have to deal with the burdensomeness of the amount of data we have. If the practices are not updated in the digital age, surge of information could overwhelm agency systems. We all understand that. It's good that the President said that. He threw down a gauntlet. Next slide. And the gauntlet was received by both OMB and the National Archives. He said, President Obama said at the time, proper records management is the backbone of open government. Next slide. The directive that I'm talking about, one that's available on that URL, is August 2012. It says something that I'm really proud that the National Archives said, and it's something that should be a wake-up call across the world, both in the public sector as well as to the extent that the private sector is taking notice, which is that by 2019, all federal agencies have to manage their permanent records in electronic format. They're permanent records. That's a small percentage of all the records in government, so it doesn't mean a paperless government, but it does lay down a marker for the future for government. Now, as part of that, by 2016, federal agencies have to manage their permanent and temporary email records in an accessible electronic format. So what does that mean? It means, frankly, that agencies need to think about electronic archiving as one type of solution that fulfills bullet point 1.2, as well as fulfills the mandate, the broader mandate of separating out permanent and temporary records so that can bring it into the National Archives. This marker is not just for the government, but it is, it is the memorandums for the government, but the policies in place really should be noticed by the larger world, because what NARA is really doing here is directing an exercise in using the best methods out there for email archiving and otherwise. And we'll talk about one policy, but we'll also talk about ways that we could go forward in the space to be smarter. Okay, next. So the directive itself, I won't read this slide to everyone, but it's basically, it has lots and lots of details to it. But there is a mandate out to industry to work with the federal government, and I think that will carry over in other areas, to work on collaborating for best of breed approaches in terms of the automated management of email, social media, and other types of digital record content, including advanced search techniques, which means auto-categorization of email, use of email archiving to a much greater extent, and use of what I term machine learning or predictive coding techniques in the space. All of this is the kind of stuff that NARA has ginned up for a conversation with the private sector, and I think it will have a broad applicability. Next slide. My process optimization problem is this. I've already said it, but let me hammer it home. There is a transactional cost to email record keeping in this age, whether it's private sector or public sector. Anyone who's on this call who spends more than 10 minutes a day with record keeping is doing too much, in my view. We should look for solutions which ease our burden that we've had for 20 years as end users, and rely on technology to provide the means for preserving records for whatever length of time that we've talked about under retention schemes. The transactional cost is too much if you have hundreds of messages a day. All right, next slide. And we need, for those of us on the East Coast in particular, but elsewhere, we need an easy pass. So next slide. And John Mancini, who's the president of AIM, has recognized this as well. I am not a subscriber that records management is dead, but traditional records management relying on end users has to change. It has to be, we need to be in an automated world where we have archives and rules and solutions in the space. And so anyone on this phone call, fundamentally, it seems to me, my message out to the world is when you're thinking about email archiving, if you think as a first axiom that individuals are going to spend the time to tag and drag and drop objects, your scheme is just not going to work. You can set up record-keeping schemes on the front end with very minimal effort, and then have the ability to transfer data into archives where the user is not involved in most of those transactions once the setup has occurred. So a little bit on the front end, but not a daily burden on everyone. And if any kind of scheme that requires a daily burden on everyone is doomed to fail, in my view. Okay, next slide. That's a really important point, and it's not something that that organizations have gotten over the last 20 years. We need an easy button. We need at least a goal of 0 keystrokes. It's a little bit elusive, but we want to point in that direction. We need an app that tags records, and we need supervised learning schemes that basically allow for the archiving of email and other records with very minimal user involvement using either rule-based or role-based solutions. I'll mention that in a second. and advanced search methods. Next slide. Under the capstone policy that NARA has put forward, what they have chosen to do is treat the world as a pyramid, and with the top-level officials, senior officials, having all of their email deemed to be permanent and put into an electronic archive with smart filters at least in place to categorize information for temporary records and material that is non-record material for everyone else, where there'll be disposition rules in place. So the disposition rule at the top of the pyramid is permanent. Disposition rules at the bottom of the pyramid could be 15 years, could be whatever is set by your organization. And in this fashion, at least, is a first approximation to what we really want to get to in the future, is really sort of intelligent archiving with a more granular rule set. But this is what NARA's first step in the space is, and hopefully will be adopted by many places in the public sector. Next slide. So here's a graphic of which is the capstone officials are at the top. Everyone else is creating temporary records, except if they are working on projects of permanent dimension. This can be applied in the private sector space to wall-off components that are, by their roles in organizations, are creating longer-term records, and we can tweak the model to basically align with auto-categorization tools that are out there, so that we can have intelligent email archiving. Next slide. The capture requirements for NARA are listed here, and I think in the interest of time we should just move on. There are obviously considerations about metadata that need to be taken into account, and we need to pay attention. None of this is easy in any kind of email archiving scheme. The other takeaway from this call, which is obvious but needs to be repeated, which is that if anybody thinks that there's a COTS product you can pull off the shelf and just implement it on day one, that is not going to happen. You need to have a working team in place, smart people from the solution provider, smart people from your organization, lawyers, records people, and IT people. It was a point that I was going to make at the end, but here I made it. So
Yeah, and Jason, can I ask, you've been doing presentations in the government, and you've been on panels with some of the leading lights of the judiciary. Have you received some feedback at all, from those who will have to judge whether the private sector or the agencies are doing things right? What do the judges think?
So the judges, I know, have been pretty harsh on the government. Judge Shenlin in particular, with NDLON, the National Day Laborers case, and others, saying that the government is at least 5 steps behind, maybe even in the dark ages. This is a path forward where we're proving that the government is stepping up to its own responsibilities. But I must say that having moved to the private sector, looking around and looking at the broader world, there is a need for getting control of data and information that is equally as much the problem of too much information and the need for defensible deletion policies, the need to build in disposition rules as part of an archiving scheme is present. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And so what I'm talking about here is not just of applicability to the feds, but to a much wider audience.
Oh, yes.
All right, next slide. So the capstone, guys, just to complete this, is that must agencies use a specific technology? No. There are a lot of solutions out there. Agencies may use native email systems, email archiving, or other repositories to implement this particular policy. But in the absence of technological solutions, it's going to be very difficult for agencies to meet the 2016 and 2019 mandate. Next slide. Go ahead. Yeah. So how to avoid a train wreck. Here's the problem with my view of email archiving, which is that we need to be smart in this space when we're buying products and looking at solutions, because keeping everything is not an option. It's going to be a train wreck in the government because the National Archives won't take all email. On the other hand, hitting the delete switch is also not an option, especially if you hit it too early and you have statute of limitations periods or regulatory compliance issues in the space. And so there's going to be a need for some email archives of, of some period of years, 7 years or up, in many verticals, and we need to be talking about how to get there for each individual organization and why it's important. But at the end of the game, end of the day, we need smart ways to dispose of data that are built in, and that's otherwise you have a train wreck of either too much data or you've deleted everything. Next slide. So there's a litigation minefield here. We could do a webinar all day on e-discovery law. The courts are imposing sanctions on parties for failing to preserve evidence. There's cases that do come out that judges say they don't do it very much, but the specter is there all the time in terms of one party or the other upset at some aspect of a case. In the absence of saving everything, it's often 20/20 hindsight in terms of how a court will look at your actions as an organization. Email archiving is a way to mitigate risk in this world, and it seems to be the best solution out there in terms of dealing with ongoing e-discovery law, especially with respect to email, which is front and center as part of every scandal and every lawsuit, it seems. Next slide. My experience, I know, if you could keep going, Mary, on that slide, one more click. Okay, so my experience with the tobacco email is really the second step of second stage of a process with White House email that has been 20 years in the making. The ZyLAB has been front and center in working with the National Security Council and NARA to develop solutions that work for archiving purposes as well as in response to the original Armstrong suit that I was associated with, and their white paper goes into detail on that. The result of the collection of email, some of which ZyLAB has been responsible for being sort of the architect behind the scenes of in terms of its collection, but some of this has ended up in huge lawsuits. And the one lawsuit I was associated with, the tobacco case, U.S. versus Philip Morris, proved to me that a need for the strength of an archive is that you can search against it. Now here, it took 6 months and 25 people to search against an earlier version, a clunkier version of an archive that was sort of custom built. However, solutions today in 2014 allow for much faster methods of going through millions of documents to get a number of hits and then to look at the space. And so that's a whole other lecture, but the importance here is that you have an archive to begin with. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. The big data information era is growing rapidly as we speak. And so if you go back if you just go back to my slide for 1 second, what I want to say about Lehman Brothers is that 3 petabytes is not out of limits. It isn't the typical case, which may go to terabytes, but each institution is looking at millions of documents, millions of emails, potentially billions over the next 10 years, and review methods like this need to be improved upon. If you have an email archive, you can improve on this method here, which really is like Jurassic Park. You can search against the collection in rapid ways using advanced search technologies. You want to ask questions of solution providers to make sure that they allow for you to be using the best methods which go beyond the Lehman Brothers experience. So that sort of wraps up what I wanted to get to, and let me turn the proceedings over, at least for a bit, to my friends at ZyLAB, Jan and Mack. And Mary.
Well, thanks, Jason. Jan, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've seen over the years in email archiving?
Absolutely. Can you go back to the previous slide for 1 second?
Sure thing.
Yeah, no, I wanted to attest to one of the things that you said, Jason. Thank you very much for all the compliments, by the way. But one of the things you said is very interesting, is that the U.S. is leading the way, and I absolutely agree in that. Not only in leading the way to find solutions, but also many of these large problems occur in the U.S. before they occur anywhere else in the world. Like this Lehman Brothers investigation, I think it was the largest digital investigation ever anywhere on the planet. And I remember when you told me, I think it was more than 10 years ago, that the National Archives are actually the largest computer museum on the planet, which really made me aware of the fact that all these electronic file formats, sustainable, the sustainable formats was really the only way forward, and proprietary archive formats are not a solution. And I think that's where the National Archives, as being one of the first, or I think the first National Archive to promote open standards, took a very visionary and leading way, and I think there's many countries worldwide that can still learn from this vision, especially the ones that are still archiving all their documents in proprietary, vendor-dependent file formats. Okay, Mary, let's take it now to the other slide. One of the other things that Jason brought up is the fact that regulatory retention periods are becoming longer as time passes by, and this is something that not only Jason noticed, it's also something we learned from the analyst, some recent analyst reports, and it's also something we see happening every day with our clients. Now, one of the most important consequences of this fact is that it is very likely that during this retention period, you probably have to convert your archives from an old to a new system at least once, and probably more times. If we look at the emails from the National Security Council that Jason mentioned, many of them have to be kept 50, or I think some of them even 100 years. There's no email archiving system from any vendor that's going to have a technical lifetime that's such a long time. And this is exactly one of the reasons why we believe that open technology and sustainable file formats that are non-vendor dependent, like XML, really are the only solution for these type of systems. If you do not keep this in mind, you can be stuck with what we call proprietary internal data structure or file formats, which result in vendor lockup. And one of the things that, from a technical point of view, I would like to emphasize here is that many email archiving solutions use single instance storage, and a lot of people are not aware that although you save some disk space, maybe up to 50%, but a lot of people are not aware that this single instance storage requires internal proprietary database and lookup systems, and there's no open system that uses single instance storage. So single instance storage can be interesting from a short-term point of view, like you can save 50% of your storage space, but in the longer term it's going to create a complete vendor lockup. It's going to also create a lot of problems when you're doing searching. It's going to slow down your searching. There's a little bit more technical information why in the white paper that Mary wrote. And I think that a lot of people have to be aware that if something that you're keeping and you know that it's going to be involved in e-discovery or litigation one day or the other, single instance storage may save you a little bit of disk space, but you should also be aware that 18 months from now the value of these disk servers is probably half of what they are now. So it's a very short-term investment with only a very short return of investment window. Now, if you take me to the next slide, Mary, please. We have an overview here. Maybe, Mary, you can elaborate a little bit on this?
Oh, sure. Sure. We were trying to do some costing, and we went to a company called Transvault, and they had an estimate of $54 per mailbox, and that's the technical cost, the people cost, the verification cost, the extra storage, all of that to do some migrations. And then to figure out what would it cost to do one migration, 2, 3, 4, or 5 migrations, depending on the number of mailboxes to be migrated. And of course, an organization doesn't always migrate each and every employee's mailbox, but if you're under a significant legal hold, some of the private sector's serial litigants, for example, have to have 5,000 people on hold is not a strange thing. And then certainly some of the financial organizations that have to hold their email for various periods of time. They may get up there in the multiple thousands, but you can talk just for one migration. We're ranging from 54,000 up into the millions of dollars to migrate. And so then what we did, well, how many migrations would you need to do? And so we figured, here's the retention periods we're in the lower right corner, the retention periods going down the y-axis, and the useful life of the archive going across the x-axis. So if the retention period is 3 years and the useful life of your archive is 5 years, you don't have to do any migrations at all. But if your retention period is, let's say, 7 years and your useful life is 5 years, which is that's a fairly long time before the release of a totally re-architected product, you're looking at least one migration. And those of you who have, say, employees that have handled asbestos, or as Jason was talking about, some of the energy industries have some very serious long-term record-keeping requirements. Then you're talking about some multiple migrations to handle the email and the other information that you're saving. So, Jan?
Yeah, no, and thank you, Mary. No, and this is a great insight in additional cost, hidden cost that, of course, exceeds the cost of saving some disk space tremendously. And it's not only in the changing regulation, it's not only the length of the retention which is changing. It's also the type of records that one needs to keep. But everybody understands that, like, records from nuclear power plants have to be kept forever. But there's also a lot of change regulation in the HR field, where if, for instance, one of your employees gets in touch with chemical toxic or asbestos or any other product, you have to keep him or her employment records for their entire life, even if they no longer work at your company. So there's a lot of these type of changes that create there more and more records that have to be kept much longer than the original 3 or 7 years. Okay, Mary, next slide, please. So what we have always promoted, we started developing this already in 2000 with our projects for the United Nations War Crimes Tribunals, which was also a group of people that needed information to be archived in open, sustainable file formats, because a lot of the investigations that they did and still do towards suspects and war criminals, it could very well be that they do not run into these individuals for the next 10 or 20 years. Some of them may still be hiding, and although they're convicted, nobody knows where they are. And this is why the UN insisted on open, sustainable archives. They didn't want they wanted to be able to access these archives 100 years from now without the help of any vendor, including ZyLAB. The National Archives was the other organization, that large organization we ran into in I think it was 2005 or 6, having exactly the same requirements. So we've always promoted this, and we believe that open file formats like XML create a sustainable, secure, and enduring infrastructure, regardless of how much information is stored. It's also very cost effective. You can archive all this information and all the structure and all the meta information in the XML files, which you can store on cheap blade servers, which are much more cost effective than databases. You don't have database maintenance. It's very easy to convert an archive. All you have to do is just copy the files. And on top of it, there's also this whole array of supporting tools that you can enhance e-discovery and disclosure, but also intelligent governance program. Jason already explained his vision on technology-assisted review and machine learning and predictive coding, where computer tools use reviewers to automatically classify and document files. You can use the same technology also for records management or for intelligent governance programs, where you can look up documents that may contain risks, bribery risks, or personal identifiable information risks, or risk related to changing regulation. And Jason has done a great job with the DESI workshops, discussing all the artificial intelligence and machine learning technology, and at the same time also making this technology defensible. Because I think, Jason, that's really where the biggest challenge is. It's the defensibility and having people trust this technology.
Yes, trustworthiness and defensibility, certainly. Over the long time, this is only going to be more important in the next 50 years.
Yeah, no, we need to fight machines with machines, and we cannot manually keep up with all the information that's being generated. But I think in all these programs, avoiding vendor lockup should really be on your checklist when you decide to buy an email archiving solution, because in real life we've seen a lot of cases of very, very unhappy clients or prospects that were using a product that was no longer supported, and that were forced to very expensive conversions, or they were forced to buy a new version of the archive solution for a ridiculously high price. And that's something you don't want to be in. Next slide, Mary. I think those were my slides. Yeah.
Right, and then I just had this last couple here, which is just simply to say that, hey, there are three languages that I always talk about: language of lawyers like myself, language of records managers and archivists, and the language of IT people who have difficulty sometimes communicating with carbon-based life forms. So, the three groups need to talk to each other in every organization. You need to think about information governance and having an interdisciplinary approach to all kinds of questions involving digital information. Email archiving can come to the fore in those conversations. It may well be that the left hand of your organization doesn't know what the right hand's doing in terms of procurement policies and going forward. You really need to think about working on this as a process to integrate different disciplines. And if I could put a plug in, go to the Sedona Conference commentary on information governance for more on that. It just came out last week, and some of us have been thinking through on IG issues generally, but email archiving is absolutely a part of the equation. My favorite quote from William Gibson: "The future is here, but it's just not evenly distributed." Everybody on this webinar is now part of the future. You've seen where the world is going in terms of capture technologies to mitigate risk. The question is, can you be an agent of change in your own organization? And I would welcome the opportunity to have a continuing conversation with people who participated in the webinar with regard to that. So thanks, Mary. Thanks, Jan.
Well, thank you, Jason. And because we're short on time, I'd like to invite anybody who has questions to email them. We'll distribute them to both Jan and Jason and make sure that that your questions are answered. You can download the white paper that both Jan and Jason were gracious enough to reference. It's a labor of love for me, a little bit of technology, a little bit of law, a little bit of records on the first step to enterprise information archiving, an e-discovery ready email archive. And I want to thank all of our listeners for their patience earlier this webcast, and a special thanks to Jan and to Jason for a wonderful elucidation of some of the forward-thinking techniques that they've been championing over the last, shall I say it, gentlemen, couple of decades.
Thanks, Mary. Yes.
Indeed. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you very much.